Now, in biology, hermaphrodites are described as beings that can be either male or female, and there's two different variations. One is simultaneous hermaphrodites, who can be both male and female at the same time, and there are also sequential hermaphrodites. Our moon is not a real moon. It's an artificial space station, and it arrived there approximately 11,000 years ago.
I think you said 64 million years ago was when that planet destroyed. That is an event that was documented in Enuma Elish, which comes out of Babylon, and originally it was Enlil that was supposed to be the person that went to fight against Tiamat, but Marduk was in charge of Babylon, so he switched names to him.
Because the Hebrews and the Jews, in my research, are totally distinct groups. I believe that the Hebrews are actually European in origin, and the Jews are actually descendants of the Canaanites, which are Asian and are part of the hybrids that were created in the Sumer area.
If you are new to this podcast, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and to share, because that helps us to be recommended in the algorithms. If you would like to support this podcast, please check out our merch store on Amazon with the brand Todd and Me. We've got some cool t-shirts, tank tops, hoodies, and sweaters. Link will be in the description of this podcast. And if you're now starting a spiritual journey, you would like to start a spiritual journey, or you're currently on a spiritual journey and you would like some help removing some fears and traumas, please hit me up on my Instagram at Adriano_246, and it will help you to get some magic mushrooms. Enjoy the show and stay tuned, because we have some more great content coming soon. What if everything you've been taught about health, history, science, even the periodic table was incomplete or just plain wrong? Hello friends, and welcome back to the Conscious Man 7 podcast. I am your host Todd Cave, and today we're joined by a man who's not afraid to challenge the foundations of our reality. Today's guest is Tim Kelly, a visionary polymath, independent researcher, and the founder of Polytope Press. Tim is the author of Natural Healing Self-Empowerment, Optiflex, Hidden History of Humanity, The Math Wizard, and many other books that span cutting-edge science, ancient civilizations, quantum energy, and the suppressed paths to enlightenment. But Tim doesn't stop at theory. He's created a 3D periodic table, developed a new theory of species origins, and written powerful exposés on independent homesteads and the nature of free energy. He proposes a stunning, highly cross-referenced story of human history, one that includes Atlantis, alien visitors, giants, flying humans, spirit mirrors, and a single hidden thread behind all world religions. If you're ready to peel back the curtain on everything you thought was true, this is the episode that could change your life.
When truth is blurred by lies and misinformation, perception becomes reality. What will you perceive your reality to be?
Liberate your fears and walk with me.
Sit down and meditate. Connect with your soul.
Be a monster and then learn how to control it.
You gotta be willing to do the work.
So it really goes really deep in terms of words and etymology and what they mean. So this is why it is really hard to really crack the matrix, because there's so many levels and layers to it, you know? Tim, welcome to the Conscious Man 7 podcast. How are you today, fella?
I am on track, and thank you for that gracious introduction.
Well, you have an extensive set of work, so I tried my best to, do you as fair as possible. And before we start, just want to say to video listeners, you would realize that Tim's camera is not on. And the reason for that is that he's received a few death threats for his research. So to protect his identity, we've agreed that he can keep his camera off. Okay, so with that out the way, let's dive right into it. So I want to start talking about origins, lost civilizations, and forbidden history. So You claim our real history includes flying humans, shapeshifters, and spirit mirrors. Are these allegories or literal suppressed truths?
These are literal suppressed truths. I think the best way to start the story is to do an overview, because if I give this overview, it sets up a framework for understanding everything that follows after it. So let me give you that overview. So let's start with a tour of the solar system. So when we look at our solar system, we see that it appears to be wrecked. Now, the number of anomalies in our solar system are huge, and it would take a very long time to go over all of those anomalies. So we're just going to focus on some of the more egregious ones. There's an equation called Bode's law, and it predicts that each planet should roughly be twice as far away from the sun as the planet before it. The equation works extremely well, except for when we get to the space between Mars and Jupiter. There we find an asteroid belt where the equation predicts a planet should exist. And there is no planet, there is only an asteroid belt. When we go beyond Mars in this asteroid belt, we find it strange that the next 4 planets are gas giants that are completely different from the planets that are inside the asteroid belt. In addition to this, we have the anomalies of moons. Earth supposedly has 1 moon, and I often do this as a trivia question. I know that you're well versed in many fields, so I will give you this little test question. How many moons do you think Jupiter currently has?
I think Jupiter has 3 moons from memory.
The current count is now 95 moons. So when we consider that information, we're left with a puzzle. Why would Jupiter have 95 moons and Earth supposedly only have 1? And when we look more closely at the moons of Mars, of which there are supposedly 2, Phobos and Deimos, if you look closely at Deimos, you can just do a search and look at an image of it. It certainly does not appear to be a natural moon. It looks much closer to a giant arbitrary chunk of rock. So when we're trying to understand anomalies like these, we look for the best science out there that will help explain everything. And when we do that, we are led to the work of Tom Van Flandern, Flandern, and his exploded planet hypothesis. So it's very easy to search for that information. And when you do, you will uncover a wealth of information strongly suggesting that there was once a planet between Mars and Jupiter that exploded. And according to Van Flandern's research, he was able to pinpoint the moment in time this occurred as approximately 3.2 million years ago. Now, when you look at that and you look at the scattering of the debris, it appears as if a weapon of some kind was discharged from the inner side of the solar system that then exploded the planet, with a majority of the mass of that planet heading into the outer solar system as debris. This debris then impacted the next 4 planets, turning them into gas giants. This would explain how all of these moons accumulated around Jupiter. The model also accounts for the stripping of water away from Mars and how the moons of Mars were then satellites of Mars. Now that we have this understanding that there was probably some kind of event that appears to be an event of conscious intent at 3.2 million years ago, we can then try to look for who could have been deploying such a weapon if it were a weapon. When Van Flandern got to this point in his research, he then consulted the geological record on planet Earth and then asked the geologists on Earth, can you look at the layer corresponding to 3.2 million years ago and see if you find confirmation for my belief in an exploded planet? When this was done, unfortunately, nothing was really found that strongly corroborated Van Flandern's hypothesis. Being a humble researcher, he backed down from his theory and said, I'm not sure if I'm right, but I will still hope that investigators will pursue the rest of the clues. Now, authors such as Joseph Farrell, who wrote a book called Cosmic War, and people like myself believe that Van Flandern is actually correct, and it is the geologists who are massively wrong in dating the timeline of Earth's history. The reason for this is due to the geologists relying too heavily on a theory called uniformitarianism. In uniformitarianism, you look down through the layers of geological strata and you assume that each distance corresponds to a specific amount of time. Now, this is not going to be strictly accurate. I'm just saying this as an example. Let's say that you say 2 centimeters is 100,000 years. Well, then if you use that model, then every 2 centimeters is going to correspond to 100,000 years. But What happens if a planet did explode? Okay, so think about how that would change the geological strata. If you had rocks the size of cities impacting the planet that were never impacting the planet like that, after a planet exploded, you would have a bunch of rock layers accumulating relatively rapidly. And it appears as if everyone in geology is not taking this into account in any way, shape, or form. When you look through the geological layer to see if there's any layer that corresponds to what Van Flandern describes, you do find such a layer. And where is that layer? 65 million years ago, about the time supposedly that the dinosaurs were rendered extinct by an impact from space. So my hypothesis then is that the geologists are completely wrong, and that the layer that they are assuming is 65 million years ago is actually the layer at 3.2 million years ago. So that would be the time when the dinosaurs, if they existed, became extinct. So then if we have this understanding that some kind of conscious beings were possibly engaged in warfare in our solar system 3.2 million years ago, the question becomes, who could have been fighting at that time? It could not have been humans. According to the fossil record, which may have its own flaws, human beings, our species, Homo sapiens, did not come into existence until approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. So if it was not us, who was it? In testimony given before Congress, which is linked in Hidden History of Humanity, which I will refer to as H3 for short, because that's quite a mouthful, an official has testified that 57 different alien species have been cataloged by the U.S. government, and this information is simply not being shared to the public. The link is provided in my book. I'm not going to go over all alien species. I don't know them. That's not my area of expertise. What I tried to do is focus on those alien species that had a demonstrable impact on human history. And there are 3 such species. The first are the Pleiadians, who stood 10 to 12 feet tall. They were giants. They looked pretty much exactly like us, with blonde or gold hair, fair skin, and blue eyes. The second group was an amphibious group known to the Dogon tribe of Mali as the Namos. These were also giants, but they had dolichocephalic or elongated skulls in a vertical direction. They were apparently amphibious, and they were also hermaphrodites. Now, in biology, hermaphrodites are described as beings that can be either male or female, and there's 2 different variations. One is simultaneous hermaphrodites, who can be both male and female at the same time, and there are also sequential hermaphrodites. These exist in our very own animal kingdom on Earth, independent of aliens. Fish are an example. Some fish can start off as male and switch to female depending on environmental circumstances. It appears as if the Namos, with these elongated skulls, had humanoid body plans, had blue skin, and tails like a fish. Now, why would they have blue skin? The answer to that appears to be that they had a different oxygen carrier. So when you study human biology, you'll understand that the molecule oxygen, which we use to breathe, is actually quite the ravager in nature. It's amazing that the animal life on Earth can use a highly destructive element and thrive on it, but we do. And we do this through oxygen carrier molecules. In the human body, our oxygen carrier molecule is based on iron, and it is called hemoglobin. However, it is not the only oxygen carrier molecule that nature offers. There is another one. It is called hemocyanin. And in the same way that hemoglobin is iron-based, hemocyanin is copper-based. It is preferred for animals in low oxygen saturation environments. So the hypothesis here, as we see countless correspondences between Namos and cephalopods, is that they were an evolutionary type of creature that became highly intelligent and had hemocyanin as a blood oxygen carrier. My hypothesis is that the depictions of Osiris in Egypt as a blue-skinned being with an elongated skull are actually accurate, because he did have blue skin and an elongated skull. We notice similarly in India that the gods are depicted in a strangely androgynous way with blue skin. And I can track this in a multitude of ways, which I will do as the story unfolds. But for now, I'm just trying to describe these 3 different groups that had a huge impact on human history. The third group is a reptilian group. And these had diagonally dolichocephalic skulls. So instead of going vertically straight up, they went backwards diagonally with elongated skulls. Now, one of their most distinctive features, which we do have records of anatomically in human history on the bones that have been covered on Earth, is slanting eye sockets. So a normal human being will have their eyes level on a horizontal line. However, there are skulls that have been found where the eyes appear to slope up and back. And this is a reptilian trait which is demonstrated in human history. So now that I have that description of who these groups are, let me go into a little bit more detail of how they impacted human history. So the first group founded the continent of Atlantis and its two major cities. These would be the Pleiadians who founded Atlantis. The capital city was in the Bermuda Triangle. It was called Poseidonis. On the eastern side of the continent was another metropolis called Tritonus. And the next group, the Nomos, who I also call the Cyanians because of the hemocyanin blood carrier, founded civilizations called Lemuria and Mu or Pan, which was located in the Pacific Ocean, while Lemuria was located in the Indian Ocean. And there's a lot to get into there, but I'm trying to go through a story rapidly here because we don't have unlimited time. So the next group would be a reptilian group that interfered with the group in Atlantis and would later found the civilization of Sumer. So let me backtrack to the Pleiadians and the founding of Atlantis, because it appears as if our species, Homo sapiens, came into existence because of what the Pleiadians did. I gather that the reptiles had destroyed multiple civilizations before. The Pleiadians were thinking that the only chance our species would have would be by getting an upgrade in intelligence. The fossil record shows that there were a multitude of ape hominids on Earth in ancient times: Australopithecus, Homo habilis, countless others. But at approximately 210,000 BC, a date we're gaining from the great psychic Edgar Cayce with a remarkable record of accuracy, Homo sapiens comes into existence at approximately 210,000 BC because visitors from the stars modeled him into his current form. So that will be how we will date the origins of our species, Homo sapiens. There were women who were referred to as Earth Mothers, which is a little bit of an inversion of a typical phrase used in this environment. Usually people will say Mother Earth mated with Father Sky. This is a simple mythological way of describing what actually happened, where beings from the stars, using Earth Mothers, generated a new species, Homo sapiens. The next major upgrade of Homo sapiens occurs at 30,000 BC. This is Cro-Magnon man. Now, Cro-Magnon man is anatomically distinct from his predecessors. Neanderthal does have a larger cranial capacity than Homo sapiens or Cro-Magnon man. However, what is significant about Cro-Magnon man is the forebrain. Now, the forebrain is the seat of the intellect. The Cro-Magnon man clearly shows a much larger forebrain, and this is where we can introduce terms from anthropology, which I already started to introduce. These are skull types. The first skull type is called brachycephalic. This is a short skull type where the forebrain, where the forehead is sloping backwards. We see this on many ape hominids and other variants of humans. What was introduced with Cro-Magnon man, who was given the higher forebrain capacity, is mesocephaly. Okay, and then finally there is the dolichocephaly, which comes from interactions with these other alien groups. Now, the interest of Cro-Magnon man is of tremendous importance to looking at the origins of life on Earth. In religion, we have the theory of creationism. We also have a theory of evolution. But when you blatantly confront the evidence around Cro-Magnon man, you definitely have a problem. If you were a religious person who believes that the Earth poofed into existence at 4004 BC, how do you explain a fossil record clearly showing the advent of Cro-Magnon man at 30,000 years, on which all scientists have been agreed on for several decades since I've been alive? If you're an evolutionist and you firmly believe in uniformitarianism, that animals suddenly, gradually appear after millions of years of adaptation, how do you explain the sudden appearance of Cro-Magnon man at 30,000 years ago? Because it does appear as if he suddenly appeared in the fossil record. We're now led to Plato's account of Atlantis, where he tells us that there was once a civilization in the Atlantic Ocean and that gods came down. Now, we can describe these gods best as, I would say, Pleiadians who came down. And that one of those gods, who was named Poseidon, mated with a mortal woman named Cleito, giving birth to 10 male twins and via 7 women who were also known as the Pleiades. Okay, hint, hint. Okay, a new race was born of demigods. We know the names of those demigods because they are included in the myth. Now, this is a perfect match. And believe it or not, as time goes by, there is further corroboration of this genetically. Now, I was perhaps the only person who put these two puzzle pieces together because I've never heard anyone make this specific connection before. But consider what I just said. According to the myth of Plato, there were 10 male twins who were created, and they mated with 7 women. Now let's fast forward to the present day, where there's what's called genetic investigation into the origins of the human species. We focus on the work of geneticist Brian Sykes, Sykes. When he's investigating human origins, he finds the following. Every European comes from one of 10 male fathers or one of 7 male women. It's a perfect match. So this leads us once again to the idea that the Pleiadians founded Atlantis and upgraded us. And when we look for the remains of Cro-Magnon man, although Cro-Magnon man is named after a village in France, the evidence shows that Cro-Magnon man arrived there primarily from the Canary Islands and the Azores, which is exactly where the remains of Cro-Magnon man have also been found. We further track different specific cultures, namely the Berbers and the Guanches. Now, when you think of an African, you do not normally think of a person with blonde hair and blue eyes. And yet, what do we see in North Africa? People with blonde hair and blue eyes. These are the Berbers and the Guanches who show cultural, genetic, and linguistic ties, which all in turn to Atlantis. And for some people, and I know that there are many people out there who want to place Atlantis all over the world and even off the planet, or even say it's a myth, what evidence is there that Atlantis was where Plato said it was? How about this? Charles Berlitz wrote a book called Atlantis, the Eighth Continent, and he added to the discussion something that the older writers were not able to add, namely, what did satellite searches and undersea exploration reveal existed on the bottom of the Atlantic? There were clear-cut indications of masonry. So yes, there was indeed a continent in the Atlantic Ocean that was populated by giants. Another source is the Roman sophist Elian, who stated the following. Atlantis was a continent that was surrounded by water. On it were giants who stood twice as tall as normal human beings and lived twice as long, and that there were 2 metropolises on the island, which, again, I just already mentioned. There was Poseidonus that was to the west and Tritonus that was to the east. Another easy way of looking at this, because Berlitz's work is quite comprehensive, he focuses a lot on the latitude of 30 degrees. But take a look at an atlas of planet Earth or a globe or whatever you like. Locate Giza. Use that as a reference point. You will find it is approximately at 30 degrees latitude. Now, NASA scientist Richard Hoagland posited something he called tetrahedral physics and wanted to call attention to the special points on the surface of any planet that were located at the latitude of 19.5. But if you do something completely different and you use a cube and insert that into a sphere, you will hit the latitude of 30 degrees. And interestingly, when you look at exactly where the Giza pyramid is located, it's like 29 point something or other. It's very close to this 30-degree point. It is the location exactly where the Great Pyramid is. Now, if you use that again as a reference point, go exactly 90 degrees west on planet Earth. You know where you will hit? The Bermuda Triangle, which is exactly where the capital of Atlantis, Poseidonus, once was. I believe there was
Okay. So this is a lot of information here. So let me just recap some of the things you said, because I find everything you're sharing quite interesting. So when you read the Sumerian tablets, it talks in the Enuma Elish about Tiamat, and how Tiamat was destroyed and created the asteroid belt. So how does your research tie into that? And then also, when you look at the Sumerian kings list, their history goes up to 432,000 years in total. And then they have these 8 immortal kings that ruled for 241,200 years. And you can see there's a huge, there's a correlation of what you're saying with the 210,000 years, where the Sumerian tablets go up to 450,000 years ago. And when you do the math, 241,200, then there was the flood. And then from there, humanity becomes significantly, the lifespan becomes significantly less. So how does those dates with the Sumerian tablets and the Enuma Elish talking about the destruction of Tiamat link into your research?
Okay, so there's a lot to break down, and unfortunately, because of exactly what you just described, there's confusion. So we have to try and dispel that confusion as best we're able. So first of all, in relation to the planet that exploded, it has been given multiple names. Tiamat is one of them. Another one is Maldek. Another one is Phaeton. So you can search for this planet using multiple examples. I'm going to stick with the name Tiamat because it is most commonly used. It is used in the group of Sumer, but in order to understand the connection to Tiamat, you have to do a few different things. So when we reference Tiamat, we're usually referencing the Sumerian term. However, we can take that term from Sumer and we can translate it into Greek. And when we do that, we hit the entity known as Thalassa, whose name translates as sea. So what we seem to be suggested here is that the exploded planet was an ocean planet, much like our own planet is largely dominated by ocean. And when we think of creatures that would be most comfortable on an ocean planet, it seems as if of the three groups I just described, the Namos or the Cyanians would be the most comfortable on that ocean planet, that it was probably their planet that exploded and that they sought a haven or a refuge on this planet after that planet was exploded. Now, one of the things I want to address very quickly to stop confusion on this particular point is the timeline that is offered by Sumer. So there's an extremely important piece of work that I came across that really helps this discussion. It was done by a Swedish investigator. His name is Victor Rydberg, last name Rydberg. You can find his work at Ancient Origins. Now, if you look at his work, he shows you a math trick, which is of extreme importance to not confusing the timeline. What he does is when you dissect that math trick, you see that these dates for 450 some thousand years ago for Sumer are way off. Once you use the math trick, the dates collapse down to a much more manageable time. And Rydberg's work, thanks to another interpreter whose name is Niels Ekblad, this work is quoted in Hidden History of Humanity. You can see how the Sumer timeline then has a perfect match to the ancient Egyptian timeline, and all the dates fall into place. So Sumer does not actually go back hundreds of thousands of years. It began at approximately 6000 BC. But I will just quickly back up a little bit, and I'll move forward to Sumer to get to the event I call the Reptile-Scianian War. I'll pause there, and then you can ask questions, and then we can jump forward. So in Atlantis, I believe a path to enlightenment was offered, which I will bring up later in this story. And the demigods that were created from the mating of Poseidon and Cleito, led by Atlas, from some people believe that Atlantis itself takes its name from Atlas, they were offered a path to enlightenment, a 7-step path to enlightenment. They rejected it. They went to the dark side. Now, if we read through the writings of Edgar Cayce, it does indeed sound as if a reptilian group of shapeshifters infiltrated the Atlantean civilization and corrupted it pretty much exactly the way that they're corrupting our civilization on Earth right now. Cayce speaks of a campaign, but this is not a military campaign. It's a campaign of ideas. And if we were to ask, what do you think those ideas were? Well, the themes are very, very obvious when you go across space and time. The themes are this. Do you want to exist in harmony with nature, or do you have an attitude of you are going to conquer nature? The reptilian path has always been conquering nature. You conquer all the animals around you. You conquer all the plants around you. You act as if you are God. You can do whatever you want to do with the human body, and you can declare yourselves to be gods and the creators of the universe. And in many ways, this is what the Sumerian reptilian civilization did. But they corrupted Atlantis, and there was a flood that occurs at approximately 9600 BC, according to Plato. But this is an important point of the story that I have to focus on. Now, I realized when I came across this evidence at first that I would be exposing myself to ridicule, but I will cite sources for what I'm about to say, no matter how outlandish it may sound. And what I'm about to say is our moon is not a real moon. It's an artificial space station, and it arrived there approximately 11,000 years ago. Now, I know for people hearing this idea, they're going to think, okay, this is really getting crazy, but hold on, because I will back this up with evidence. So first of all, I came across this in the book called Shadow of Atlantis by Brzezinski. He speaks of a tribe called the Pre-Selenites who speak of a time before the moon. That was the first time I heard it. Then I heard that Egyptian records were far more extensive than we thought, and that they had records of a lunar calendar, but one that went back 11,000 years. In addition to that, there is actually testimony, believe it or not, all over planet Earth, where people in countless continents, tribes that spoke completely different languages, all say the same thing. We have tribes in Alaska that believe that there was a time before the moon. We have the Chibchas in South America believe that there was a time before the moon. In ancient authors, we have several prominent figures, among them Aristotle, Apollonius of Rhodes, Democritus, who is the ancient philosopher who first gave us the idea of the atom, that matter is made of individual structures that cannot be broken down any further. We have a philosopher by the name of Anaxagoras. We have Plutarch. We have Ovid. All of these people are speaking of a time before the moon. Now, if you want to hear science to back this up, you do an internet search using the following phrase: scariest book of all time. You can also use an additional phrase, no moon prior to. There you can see the science, which corroborates the fact that the moon arrived relatively recently. When you corroborate that with the other evidence that we see, for example, in the ancient site called Göbekli Tepe, there is a indication in the carvings of a comet storm that hit approximately around the time that Atlantis fell. This is roughly the same time that the moon arrived. Now, we already know from our terrestrial experience that the moon has a great influence on the ocean tides on planet Earth. Now, imagine how devastating it would be if the moon were to arrive for the very first time. How devastating would that be on the ocean tides of Earth? And again, while some people may say Plato just did his math wrong, it didn't really fall at 9600 BC. I think he's just way off. There is actually geological evidence, and I cite that in the book, showing that he was actually right. It was around 9600 BC that it went down. And in the Timaeus dialogue, we hear of an ancient group of Athenians, as they're sometimes called, but they do have another name, and you can do this research for yourself. This group is sometimes called the Pelasgians or the Arcadians. Pelasgians, Pelasgians, and then Arcadians is pretty easy to spell. You can find more information on them going to Wikipedia and entering the word Proselenos, Proselenos. And then you can read of all the different people who are confirming that this group existed in ancient Greece, just like Plato described in the Timaeus dialogue. They were led by an ancient Athena, because there's actually two Athenas that somehow got confused together later. But there was an ancient Athena who defended the Atlantean colonies in the Mediterranean basin from an attack force that was launched by corrupted Atlanteans who had their base in Tritonus on the island of Arion after Atlantis, the continent, had been broken up into three different pieces. So this invasion force had set out. They were stopped by an ancient group led by Athena of Arcadians and Pelasgians, and they were swallowed up in a flood that consumed Atlantis. Then there's a period of quiet until the Sumer civilization is launched. Now, it is my understanding that the Sumerians fully understood how technologically advanced Atlantis and its legacy colonies were. They knew that the greatest threat to conquering planet Earth was to overcome the advanced civilization that existed in Giza and that could wield a Great Pyramid. For people who are unfamiliar with the idea that the Great Pyramid represents the pinnacle of technology, I will turn you to the following sources so that you may be oriented. The first is the no-nonsense machinist Christopher Dunn, who wrote the book called The Giza Power Plant. If you can handle that physics and you can go even deeper, great. Then read the writings of Dr. Joseph Farrell in the Giza Death Star trilogy. He offers even more intense physics, showing you that this was a sophisticated technological device. Beyond that, you can look up the work of Gregory Herman. This is available online, and basically what we are led to is the following. So I'm just going to give you a taste of what the Great Pyramid can do. At its most basic level, it acted as a preservation device. So it would generate a life force field so that food and life would not decay. So you wouldn't need a refrigerator. using a Great Pyramid as a storage facility. Actually, my research indicates that the second wonder of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, is directly connected to the Great Pyramid in Giza. The reason for this is pointed out by author Tony Bushby, who wrote a book called Secret in the Bible. In that book, he shows you an old map of Cairo in which he shows you that the original site of Babylon is not the site that we think of as Babylon today. The original site of Babylon was actually where Cairo is now. So in other words, the original Hanging Gardens of Babylon would have been right next to the Great Pyramid, feeding off its full spectrum light. For people who are not familiar with full spectrum light is equivalent to sunlight. It can be made artificially, and when you use it, you can grow plants indoors. There are lights available like this today. I mentioned that in my health research and my technology research. A company that produces them is called Blue Max, for example, and they can show you that their lights will indeed grow lights indoors. Now, in Tesla's work, one of the greatest geniuses of all time, he shows you the ability to generate phosphorescent light by vibrating a substance called calcium sulfide at approximately 10,000 hertz. Why is that relevant to a Great Pyramid? Simply because a Great Pyramid had on its outer casing limestone, which in turn has calcium sulfide in it. And it would have been a breeze for the Atlanteans to oscillate that calcium sulfide and give off full spectrum, cold to the touch, phosphorescent light that would have made these plants around the Great Pyramid and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon grow, giving abundant food to everyone nearby. The next level of technology for a Great Pyramid is as a communications device. Now, in physics, and especially in suppressed science, there is an idea called an aerial battery. It's a resonant generator of a signal. So the capstone or the pyramidion that was on top of the Great Pyramid is an example of an aerial battery or a resonant capstone. Now, if we again turn briefly to the work of Tesla in Colorado Springs, we see how this technology works. In Tesla's case, he had what were called mass resonant copper spheres that were on top of his machinery. So if he projected power or a signal to a copper sphere, and there was another copper sphere some distance away that had the exact same mass, both a communication signal and a power signal would jump from one copper sphere to the other. He planned on giving the whole world free energy with a modification of this device. The resonant capstone atop a Great Pyramid actually works the same way, and the psychic Edgar Cayce told Tesla, supposedly, that he was a reincarnated Atlantean. So it does appear as if Tesla was simply resurrecting the technology of Atlantis. And we do know how that technology worked from the aforementioned authors. It was basically what I call a pulsator. A pulsator is a pulsed static electricity generator. So in the 1930s, in Scientific American, you can find an article by John Trump, who is actually related to the current president, coincidentally. And he was investigating Tesla's work, and he made the following statement. If you could master it, static electricity would actually be more powerful and more effective than dynamic electricity, which we commonly use. This is what Tesla did, and we actually know how he did it. If you reference the book Secrets of Cold War Technology by Jerry Vassilatos, he explains how Tesla did what he did using pulsed static electricity. This would give you an ultimate telecommunication signal, one that could work all across the globe, and it could generate power as well. And we see that when it generates power, we are again finding a perfect match to the psychic visions of Edgar Cayce, who described a civilization based on resonant power where all of these ships were relying on power that was being projected to them. So again, and this is just actually scratching the surface of what the Great Pyramid could do. It could not only send telecommunication signals around the planet, but across star systems. It's relevant to our story to note the origins of several of these alien groups. The reptilians supposedly came from the Draco constellation. The Pleiadians came from the Pleiadian constellation. The most likely home for the Cyanians/Nomonts is the star system of Sirius. I mention this simply because all three are only visible from the northern hemisphere. This explains why much of the ancient activity was focused initially on the northern hemisphere, because each could look at their own home star system from where they were. So looking at all of that, then we have these three different groups, and then we see the reptilian group arriving with this moon space station, because it appears as if when the moon arrives, that is a reptile base, just like the Death Star in Star Wars. And it is known that George Lucas did have inside information and used that in writing his Star Wars movies. So when the Sumer civilization is founded, I believe it was founded as a staging area to wage a war against the people who were still left with great intelligence in Giza. And it took them a while to set this civilization up. I take this story from Flying Serpents and Dragons, which is a book anyone can access. You can actually download the PDF if you want. This is written by the author Boulay, Boulay. And in that book, he describes the advent of the Sumer civilization, how the swamps were drained, how there were advanced technical cities with spacefaring capabilities that were set up. And he goes into great detail in that. And then he talks about the Anunnaki. So I want to just pause on the Anunnaki to clarify another source of potential confusion here. So according to Boulay, the oldest Sumerian writing begins with the sentence, "Verily, the reptiles descend." And then this was before the time of Enki and the Anunnaki. But when we get to the Anunnaki, I think it's important to understand the dynamics here. We have reptiles who are administering this conquest plan from afar. These are known in the Bible as the Elohim. Eventually, that would actually become the word Allah in the religion of Islam, believe it or not. It's just a grammatic change over time. But in any case, the Elohim were full-blood reptilians, often depicted as Siakar or white-skinned. The Shining Ones is another reference that often comes up in relation to these beings. But they're not suited to being on the surface of the earth. Supposedly, they hate ultraviolet light. They can't stand being around the surface. They show the physiology of what are called troglobionts. These are cave dwellers. That's beings who would normally prefer to see via infrared by the heat signatures that are given off by life forms. So they do not like the surface of the earth. So they needed administrators who would be comfortable actually walking around on the surface of the earth. And my evidence suggests that a hybrid species was manufactured to be their administrators. This hybrid species was made of species that were already able to adapt on the surface of the earth. And who were those? The Cyanians. Now, I want to put in this other important piece of reinforcement for the Cyanians as being administrators of Giza. I, at first, was not sure if I wanted to fully believe that Osiris was a Cyanian until I came across the writings of Graham Hancock and Arboval, who stated the following. There's an ancient historian in Egypt whose name is Manetho. He wrote a book called The History of Egypt. And although that book was lost, there were commentators on Manetho's work who quoted from him. And what Manetho said was, he had seen wooden effigies of the former divine and semi-divine rulers of Egypt. And these were all giants that they reproduced without the agency of women. Now, that's a very curious phrase for someone to put into their history, but there's only one species that would reproduce without the agency of women in this story. It's the Cyanians. They're hermaphrodites. They're capable of actually doing virgin births because, in a sense, if you're reproducing with yourself, you're not having sexual reproduction. So you could argue that that kind of parthenogenesis is legit. But this reinforces the idea that the Cyanians were administrating Giza. And this is further reinforced by author Tony Bushby, whose book Secret in the Bible has tons of clues, including the following. According to the often sober historian Herodotus, he found the Egyptians telling him, when he was asking them of their history, that they stated the following. There was traffic from the sky gods. This traffic began at 17,500 BC. That Osiris first appeared in Giza at 15,500 BC. That the traffic from the sky gods stopped at 11,850 BC. Again, you can find this in Secret in the Bible by Tony Bushby. So this again confirms that we had Cyanians administrating Giza. And the war then began between the forces administering Sumer when they were ready. And this becomes encoded in history as a myth that we still know quite well to this day. This myth is the myth of Osiris, Set, and Horus. Now, in that myth, we see a contention between Set and the forces who are administrating Giza. Now, we might not know much more than we get out of this myth, but we had a very special clue that unlocked this entire story about the war to take down Giza from the reptiles fighting those who were administrating Giza. This book is well known to many people. This book is the Mahabharata. Now, in the Mahabharata, you hear a story of an epic clash that sounds like something straight out of science fiction. You hear stories that sound like the detonation of nuclear weapons. You hear stories of flying craft called Vimana. You hear all kinds of stories of what I would call Mercury superphysics. Now, Mercury superphysics is interesting because it appears to represent the pinnacle of Scientian technology. You can understand this by understanding that Mercury is well known to be a superconductor, conducts electricity extremely well with no friction, and that there are engines that you can build, which are described in H3, for flying craft based on Mercury superphysics. So yes, there is evidence of an ancient war, and this is covered by author David Hatcher Childress in an article that you can find online called Evidence of Ancient Atomic Warfare. You will find that there are certain sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa that have extremely high radiation counts, indicating some form of ancient nuclear warfare or something that's equivalent to that. This was encoded, I argue, in the Mahabharata. And I came across an amazing scholar, and I was so glad that I found his work because it allied so many things together and is very, very important for what we're about to discuss about the origins of religion. This scholar's name is von Mondion, and what he did was show conclusively that the Mahabharata really has nothing to do with Indian origins, that those stories were swiped wholesale from Egypt, and the myth of Osiris, Set, and Horus. He shows you 16 events that showed in the Egyptian story and how those perfectly map to all the events that are in the Mahabharata. So what really happened in ancient history was the following. An ancient war was fought between the rulers of Sumer and the administrators of Giza. I place this war at approximately 3400 BC. After that war was over, Set, who I would argue is actually the same being as Seth, the third son of Adam, was sent to infiltrate Giza. And when he was not able to uncover all the secrets and successfully shut it down, a war was fought. In the aftermath of that war that was won by the reptiles, a new species of being, yet another hybrid, was created. Horus was the first of these. In Tony Bushby's work, he shows that archaeologists and paleontologists had dug up the bones of the first administrators of Egypt before the first dynasty even began. They were giants. They had elongated skulls, but now they no longer had hemocyanin as a blood carrier. They had probably hemoglobin. So now we're looking at dolichocephalic giants that no longer have blue skin, but have more human-like skin. Very, very interestingly, one of the most sadistic characters you'll ever encounter in ancient history is a person called Akhenaten. You can look him up. You will see he has an elongated skull, and he has male and female characteristics. This is yet another indication that this was a descendant of this hybrid bloodline. But the Anunnaki themselves, however, should not be understood as Scientians because they were hybrids that were created. In Boulay's writing, he distinctly states that the Anunnaki had both male and female beings. Enki was male, and Enlil was male, and Nana, on the other hand, was female. So they're not exactly Scientians. And if you look at the website, mesopotamiangods.com, you will see depictions of beings like Enki standing on two legs with a tail like a fish, which is exactly the description of what Scientians would look like, except the top of their body looks pretty much nothing like what a Scientian would have looked like. And if you go over the ancient writings and see how these beings were described, they were described as repulsive abominations. Now, I don't think the Scientians would qualify as repulsive abominations. They probably appear very weird to us, but not repulsive abominations. They were hybrids that were manufactured in all probability by a base that was called the Apsu or the Abzu. This appears to be some kind of advanced reptile spaceship base that was used to create these beings. So after this war is fought, we know that the forces that were administering Sumer took over the site at Giza, and then they forced the natives to tell them their secrets. How do we know this? By hieroglyphics. Now, there's an ancient language of Atlantean. Everyone in Giza would have known that. There's no need to create a new language. There's no need to create hieroglyphics. Why create this elaborate picture language out of nowhere, which clearly traces exactly to the time frame of the aftermath of the reptile Cyanian War, as I call it. It was because the languages of Sumer and the languages of Giza were so different, the easiest way to communicate was to force this picture language into existence. And I cite a scholar who states the following: if you look closely at Egyptian hieroglyphics, they have an exact phonetic match to the syllables in Sumerian. So that proves the fact that hieroglyphics are not native to Egypt. They were forced into existence so these two groups could communicate with each other. There was a 7-step path to, I would say, enlightenment that was taught in the mystery schools at Giza. This is told by Tony Bushby in Secret in the Bible, a book I referenced earlier. He tells you what some of those 7 steps were in the gutted, destroyed version of the path to enlightenment that was then presented to mystery school initiates like Aristotle, like Plato. Many of these people were getting their information after being initiated in mystery school in Egypt. So what was in that 7-step program? According to the Bushby version, and I do not believe this was the original version, this was just the watered down, gutted version so that you wouldn't be super smart, was the following. Step 1 was physical sciences. Step 2 was geometry and architecture. Step 3 was language and hieroglyphics. Step 4 was laws, which I find hard to believe was ever in the original program. But step 5 was chemistry. Step 6 was astronomy. And step 7 was final revelation. Now, constantly they make reference to temples when they talk about all of this stuff. But if I were to ask you, what type of building do you think I would be describing if I said I went to a certain location and I was taught physical sciences, geometry, architecture, chemistry, and physics? What kind of place does it sound like I'm at?
A mystery school?
Yeah, but doesn't it sound a lot like a university today?
Well, yes, a university, yes.
It certainly sounds more like a university than a temple. Would you agree?
Yeah, more than, yeah, agreed.
Okay, so we had this path to enlightenment that was now lost. And from that time on, the mystery schools were taken over, and what were introduced were the sun god cult scams. These was the origin of all the world's major religions. So I will pause here as I promised. I will allow you to ask any questions you want before we get to the origins of religion, and I will take a much needed sip of water.
Wow. You covered a lot there. And just to clarify, I agree that the Sumerians are only about 6,000 years at max. But what I was referencing is that their records seem to confirm the stuff that you're saying. So I mostly look at things from like the Gnostic texts, and I align them with the Sumerian tablets. So I think you said 64 million years ago was when that planet destroyed. That is an event that was documented in Enuma Elish, which comes out of Babylon. And originally it was Enlil that was supposed to be the person that went to fight against Tiamat. But Marduk was in charge of Babylon, so he switched names to him. Regardless of who it was, it seems that that event was an actual cosmic battle between planets, which you alluded to. So I guess it may just be you're bringing some context to show maybe the timeline, which I think you said 64 million. So that's very interesting. And then also, I basically say the same thing that you say, that is like 210,000, because the Sumerian tablets talk about a time of 450,000 and the 8 immortal kings going up to 241,200, which gives you circa 210. Because after that, the lifespan of humans considerably goes down. So that was a genetic modification, to, as you seem to put it as well. So I think we're quite aligned in there. But my question then is flying humans. So how do we, because you talked about the shapeshifters. So the shapeshifters would be the reptilian set of extraterrestrials that came here. So flying humans and spirit mirrors, where do those come from?
Okay, so excellent. So there are several different threads to tackle there. I'll tackle the reptilians first because that's actually a little bit easier. So the first time in my research that I came across the idea of shapeshifting reptilians was in The Biggest Secret by David Icke. So when I came across those stories, now keep in mind too that when Icke was offering his presentation, he wasn't just saying, this is my opinion. he was also offering testimony from very specific individuals. One such is Kathy O'Brien. Now, the story of Kathy O'Brien is horrific. It's one of probably the single worst negative story I've ever heard in my entire life. But it is, if you want that to read it, if you have the guts and the courage to get through something that negative, her book is called Transformation of America. And in that book, she talks about situations where she was in a mind control program and she saw world leaders shapeshift into reptilians. So when this happened, Ike recited that along with other people who had seen the exact same thing. And I was puzzled by this because I have a strong background in science and I was trying to understand how this could even be possible. So my gut reaction the first time I heard it was, okay, maybe it's just a technology. Maybe they just have the ability to project holograms over top of themselves and it makes it seem like they're shapeshifting, but they're not actually shapeshifting. That was my first guess. But then as I got closer to this, I actually saw that they were shapeshifting. And then I got really disturbed thinking, well, this makes no sense. I mean, I've studied nature so many different ways. I've never heard of shapeshifting before. And then I said to myself, well, you know what? I'm just going to stop here and I'm just going to reevaluate. Maybe I missed something when I was growing up. So I did a search. Are there any species on planet Earth capable of shapeshifting like what these guys supposedly could do? And then I discovered there is. So you can find this creature yourself. There's videos of it on YouTube. It is kind of disturbing to watch, but it is, spectacular at the same time. The creature is called the mimic octopus. So if you do a YouTube search for this creature, you will watch this thing kind of transform itself to look like one animal after another animal after another animal. I mean, it can look like almost any creature in its vicinity. It has a repertoire of at least 10 creatures that are very different from each other, totally different colors, totally different masses, and you can see it shift. So after I came across that information, I got extra scientifically curious about how it was doing this. One of the most scientifically violating ideas that I couldn't get past was changing mass. I was like, you can't change mass. I have a strong science background. You cannot change mass. That doesn't make any sense. So how are they doing that? So then I had to read these articles about those people who actually dissected mimic octopi to see how they worked. And they discovered things that I've never heard of before on any terrestrial creature. Now, the first thing I did hear of, and most people out there who know animal biology will have heard of this one, it's called a chromatophore. Chromatophores exist in creatures like chameleons, anoles, certain species of fish. These are the ability to change color. Now that we knew that certain animals could do. They use it for camouflage. Fish use it on the ocean floor. There's a whole bunch of creatures who use that one. But then I heard of these other structures I'd never heard of before. These are called iridophores and leucophores. And there's abilities to create the effects used by the mimic octopus, which are consciously controlled. I had never heard of any creature capable of doing anything like that. And then when I looked at the description of everything that the mimic octopus could do, I said, you know what? This perfectly matches what these reptilians supposedly can do. And then I saw more footage convincing me that this actually was a physiological phenomenon, not a technological one. So that would be how the shapeshifting evidently occurs. Now, I don't know if reptilians originally were this way as predators, but given their mentality, I could easily picture some reptilians who were just very nasty, who came across a creature like a mimic octopus and showing no regard for the sanctity of any genome anywhere, because they never do that at all anywhere in their history. I could see them saying, oh, we need that. We got to get that stuff incorporated into us. Create a new hybrid right away. We can use that. We can overthrow one civilization after another all over the galaxy. We can go into any civilization. No one will even know that we're there. And all we have to do is just start telling people, hey, you need to conquer nature. Don't be a sissy. You have to go around, kill all these animals. You have to be strong. You have to be tough. You have to kill. That's the only way you come out on top. Life is tough. Nature's brutal. Just that's your philosophy. They spread that everywhere until everything's dead and they're on top. So that would be that story. As for the flying humans, I referenced that. The reason why Todd's bringing that up is then part of my description of my tales of the ancient past, I mentioned flying humans. So that's why he's asking me about that. So where that story comes from, though, is interesting. And part of the reason why I want people to ask me about that is because it's part of a form of advanced technology. Now, people who are familiar with alternative history and suppressed technology will have heard similar stories before, but the basic idea is along these lines. With the correct application of frequency, you can negate gravity. Okay, so this was used in ancient Egypt. Now, if we look at the construction of structures like the Great Pyramid, we see puzzles. A number of the blocks that make up the Great Pyramid weigh 20 tons. There are some structures nearby, relatively speaking, in Asia, that weigh 50 tons. Some have been estimated at 500 tons. There's an uncut block that was not put in. Yes.
Oh.
And at that site, one of the places where a block was not erected is estimated at 1,200 tons. So how are they moving this? Now, if you go through a lot of, somewhat silly presentations on the internet, they'll say yes, they built the Great Pyramid using log rollers. I mean, okay, take a log roller, put a multi-ton block in a bunch of sand, try to roll it and see how much luck you have. But no, if you have a 20-ton block, the other question I would like somebody to ask is, if it's 1,000,000 times easier to move a block that is 20 pounds, why would you want to move blocks that are 20 tons? And there had to be a reason that you're moving blocks around that are that heavy with ease. And if you consult all the suppressed science that I've looked at, and I do present a lot of this in H3, the most plausible technology is one that uses frequency to negate gravity. Supposedly, the diminutive man known as Ed Leedskounen, who constructed a special structure that you can see on video, this is linked in several of my books, the structure is called Coral Castle, you will see that he moved multi-ton blocks with ease. Not only did he do that, but when he was talking about how he did it, he stated the following: I have uncovered the secrets of the pyramid builders. So he's telling you right there that he was using frequency to overcome the force of gravity. So in relation to the question of flying humans, there is an investigator by the name of Harold Wilkins who wrote a book called Secret Cities of Old South America. And in that book, he tells the story that he uncovered, which is that supposedly in Atlantis, there were beings who put what were called Klangplatten, that's from the German version of the word, or sound discs. They would wear these like necklaces, and these discs would be pretty much on their chest. When these discs were struck with the right vibration, human beings would lift off the ground, levitate, and fly. And supposedly, Wilkins tells the story of one of these discs that was uncovered and given to a ruler of Spain, who then applied the disc, and he and his wife were actually able to levitate and fly off the ground when the right frequency was struck. But Wilkins also, interestingly, I know, Todd, you have a little bit of a background in mysticism, so you might appreciate this part. The idea was that each individual had their own frequency, which seemed to have something to do with their aura or their energy field, and that the discs had to be attuned to that in order for them to lift off the ground and fly.
Right? You're basically describing Magneto, because he could levitate, because he could manipulate the metal on his shoes. And I guess maybe, I've told my age already online, but when this story here that I'm going to say, if anyone remembers in the late 80s and 90s, there was a cartoon series called Centurions. And this cartoon series, he used to talk about in the near future, Doc Terror and his cyborg companion hacker unleashed forces to conquer Earth. And then there was a team of people. There was Ace McCloud, there was Jake Rockwell, the Max Ray, and there was another character that I can't remember because he came later. Long story short, these guys had things called exoframes, and it was a suit that they would wear. And when they say power extreme, when the lady that was in the spaceship above Earth would beam the equipment onto them, and they would stretch up their hands like that. And when they have on the exoframe, the mechanical parts would fit onto them. Now, this part here, I only understood as an adult, but I couldn't understand as a child. So these guys would be flying in the air or underwater or riding on the land, right? And they would be using what I would say now is their consciousness to steer the vehicles, because he would just be thinking and he would shoot missiles or shoot the gun, and the plane would manipulate as he was going, Ace McCloud, and it'd be based on consciousness. So what you're talking about in terms of consciousness and being tuned to these metals is literally what was shown to us in that cartoon, Centurions in the late 80s. And there was another one called G-Force, which was another fantastic anime sort of like
I recall
cartoon. Yep. And you remember they would have these watches and they would bring their hand in front of them and then they would have like these wings and they could fly, you know?
Correct.
And it was like amazing. So the thing is, what I find quite crazy, right, is that the stuff that I learned as an adult, when I go back to look at some of the cartoons, I'm like, they've been blatantly telling us this from the time we're children. But because it's a cartoon, you think, oh, well, it's just sci-fi, it's just like a cartoon, right? It's not really real. But as you're rightly saying, no, like, because even before you mentioned Ed and Coral Castle, that was one of the things that like started me down this rabbit hole of this entire genre of information. And there was another guy in Australia that I found, and there was a story where he ordered some, I think it was 1.5 ton bags of grit or stones or something like that. And when the grab lorry came, the guy told him, oh, well, you can, the guy asked him, do you need help with this being taken off? Because these were like these massive bags. He said, no, I don't need any help. He says, just go over there for a bit and come back and I'll take them off. And the guy did it. He thought it was a bit weird. But when he looked backwards, he saw the guy have like these 2 cones in his hand and he was manipulating it, like spinning it. And he was lifting the 1.5 ton bags off the truck like that. And when the guy came back, the guy was like completely blown away. It was like, what? So there actually have been people like Ed and this other guy that I found in Australia that have the same kind of technology for, I guess you could call it anti-gravity, or I don't know what else you can call it, because you can seem to attune the metal or whatever device with sound to be able to take away the actual mass and the weight of the item and make it float, and you can manipulate it. So it's very, very interesting, those stories.
Yes, I in H3, I also mentioned the work of John Worrell Keeley. So Keeley was a sort of a contemporary of Tesla, but unfortunately, Keeley, for all his brilliance, was more of an Edisonian type inventor, meaning that he didn't have a strong background in theory. He wasn't able to articulate his ideas in proper scientific and mathematical language. Nevertheless, he worked with cones that also negated gravity, and he had a number of anti-gravity devices in his laboratory. He spoke of what he called enigmatically the chords of mass that he was able to manipulate and make objects fly. And there are citations for that story as well. So there are a multitude of people who have found ways to negate gravity via vibration and sound.
Okay, so we can take a very quick break here. We can say, if this conversation is already blowing your mind, pause for a second and hit that like button, subscribe and share this with someone who's ready to rethink everything. This episode could change how we see the world, and more people deserve to hear it. So, you mentioned Atlantis was a real civilization, and you gave many sources and cited about it. But what happened to it, and what did they know that we have forgotten?
Okay, so there were degrees of understanding. So the full-blood Pleiadians had the most advanced understanding, and the demonstration of that is the description I gave you previously of the Great Pyramid, which not everyone fully understood. I think the Cyanians inherited Giza as a legacy, but they never fully understood the depth of the structure and everything that it was capable of doing. The demigods were being instructed in how to use forms of advanced technology, but they were also seduced by the dark side. Now, in the writings of Edgar Casey, he makes repeated references to those called the sons of Belial. These would be the people who were working on the dark side. Now, how was I able to correspond that to reptilians? Well, it's just very, very fascinating. After Casey makes countless references to forms of technology he's never seen in his own life, and makes countless references to the being called Belial as being the one who corrupted many of the people in ancient Atlantis. He dies in 1945. 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls appear. And guess what? When they start digging into the Dead Sea Scrolls, they make reference to what appears to be a serpentine being whose name is Belial. Exact match in spelling. So,
say that again. So this guy is that old?
No. Okay, I'm saying that Edgar Casey, the psychic, was talking about visions he had of Atlantis.
Right.
And that Belial was the force for darkness, and that he died. Edgar Casey died in 1945, and that 2 years later, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, pretty much corroborating what he had said. So back to Atlantis. The demigods were offered the positive path to enlightenment, and then the reptiles seduced them with the dark side. And especially on the metropolis to the east, known as Tritonus, the forces of darkness got especially strong and eventually turned into that invasion force trying to conquer the Atlantean colonies and other locations, including in West Africa and North Africa. A lot of talk has been about the Recot structure that's been discovered in Mauritania, which is corresponded to many people to be the actual city of Atlantis. My research shows that's just one of many Atlantean colony cities that imitated the Poseidonus ring design. That city, I believe, is actually known in the ancient literature as Cerne. That could be pronounced Cerny or Kearney, or I'm not sure what the proper pronunciation of that would be. But there are ancient records that do indicate that there was Atlantean colonies in Northwest Africa. And that's why there's so many blonde-haired, blue-eyed people who were there, because they were descended from that group. And that's corroborated by other aspects of ancient history as well. But once the Atlanteans were seduced by the dark side, refugees began to flee. And there was another island in the northeast called Ogygia, and that was pretty darn close to Ireland. So a lot of the Atlantean refugees went up into Ireland and crossed over into what is the UK now, but especially settled in Britain and Scotland. The dark traditions of Atlantis were present in what would have been the predecessor to the Druids. So in other words, the Druids trace their origins to Atlantis. The traditions actually carry that far across time. Further corroboration of this is found in an artifact you can look up online. It's called the Coligny calendar. It's Coligny. And in light of what we were just discussing that piqued your interest, I will tell you, if you're familiar with the work in cymatics of Hans Jenny and several other people, and clady figures, which are the shapes that are formed when you hit specific frequencies, those were encoded in the Coligny calendar. So we're seeing that the ancients knew about cymatics. They knew about the sounds and specific shapes that are formed at specific frequencies. So this truly is some ancient knowledge. So basically what we had then is two dark traditions. There was the Atlantean dark tradition that was encapsulated by the Druids. And I believe that the Druids eventually formed an emissary group to find out what the Sumer group was doing after the Sumer group got started. This emissary group is the Chaldeans. So I believe that the Chaldeans are actually European in origin. They came down, initially fought some of the forces that were part of the dark side that began in Sumer. But after fighting them and learning more about them, it was, if you can't beat them, join them. So I think the Chaldeans assimilated and eventually became the Habaru, which we know today as the Hebrew, because the Hebrews and the Jews, in my research, are totally distinct groups. I believe that the Hebrews are actually European in origin, and the Jews are actually descendants of the Canaanites, which are Asian and are part of the hybrids that were created in the Sumer area. Now, R.A. Boulay is actually very specific when he talks about this. When he talks about the creation of Adam, he talks about the creation of Adam as the first, as I would say, Nephilim. So I believe that Adam was the prototype Nephilim. And then once the reptiles saw that this prototype was going to work, they were like, okay, let's make a lot of them now. So then they started making a lot of these Nephilim half-breed people. And for a number of people who are wondering, are you really sure that you want to back up this claim? And I would say yes, because of the following. So one is the eye socket characteristic that I was mentioning before. The reptilian hybrids have different eye sockets that slope up and back. This is found in a number of ancient skulls. And in addition to that, if you want to understand genetic anomalies, you have to focus on what I focused on. So you can do a Wikipedia search on this one. It's called ichthyosis. Basically, that translates as fish skin. So if you look at ichthyosis and the distribution of it around the world, you will find this genetic anomaly occurs primarily in areas that were known to be heavily influenced or under the influence of Nephilim. So all of that tracks. And Atlantis was led to the dark side. I believe that the original plan was as follows. I believe the Pleiadians were hoping that when they created the demigods from the hominids of Earth, this is, again, the line that starts with Atlas and the 10 twins, they were hoping to teach them the path to enlightenment, which we'll get to at the end, and create a great pyramid network. So there would be 8 great pyramids, one at each of the corners of a cube when inserted into the sphere of the Earth. This would then have communication in all directions and defense in all directions. And I think part of the desire to create defense in all directions is that the debris from the exploded planet was still a major problem. We kept getting hit with more of these rocks, even though it's millions of years later, there were still impacts from space. And if they could create a shield around the planet would be protected and people could enjoy happy, long-lived lives. But they chose the dark side. They chose killing. And how do we know that? We know from the dialogue of Plato. He's telling you right there what they did. In that dialogue, he states that the 10 princes of Atlantis gathered at what was called the Temple of Poseidon. They killed bulls. They drank their blood. They burned them. They set them on fire. They threw their blood on sacred pillars. None of this behavior sounds positive to me, even though the way Plato describes it, he makes it sound like this was somehow sacred and honoring Poseidon, which it does not sound to me like it was honoring Poseidon at all. It sounds like they were spitting in his face, saying, we've chosen the dark side. This is the direction that we're going. And these cult practices, of course, spread off of Atlantis. The most basic practice of the dark side that is very easy to track is the bull sacrifice. You see this all over the ancient world. Anywhere the dark side from Atlantis went, they were sacrificing bulls left and right. And of course, we see precedents for this in the beginnings of the Bible. One of the things that people don't call enough attention to is the story of Cain and Abel, because just take another look at that. And the version of that story is not even the full dark side version that I read. But in any case, in that story, Cain makes an offering of plants to this godlike being, and he is rejected. He is told that is not good enough. And it is Abel who offers a slaughtered animal and offers spilled blood, and God's like, that's what I want. That's what I want. So then it's like Cain kills Abel. And in the dark side version that I read, Cain doesn't just kill him, he actually eats him. So after this, you're thinking, okay, so this is the God that everyone wants to worship as the positive, benevolent, happy God. Well, let's say that he's just a not super positive God. Let's just say he's a God of justice. Okay, well, Cain just murdered his brother and ate him. So what form of justice does this God offer to Cain? He says, when Cain is worried that everyone's going to come and attack him now that he did this horrible deed, he said, don't worry about it. I'll protect you. I'll make sure that you're safe and you won't be punished at all. So very disturbing start to that particular story. But as you track the story through time, you see from R.A. Boulay, as presented in Flying Serpents and Dragons, that the God of the Old Testament is a composite, as many of these characters in the Bible are. So who is the God of the Old Testament? He's a composite of Enki and Enlil and a number of other people. So for the most part, the Garden of Eden site is actually best understood to be the ancient Sumerian site that is known as Eridu, E-R-I-D-U. That was Enki's base. That's where this new Nephilim line started by Adam and his descendants began. And they wanted you to think that this line, which R.A. Boulay calls a homosaurian line, he explicitly says that. He says Adam was a homosaurus. But again, you can read that for yourself in his writing. He wants from then on for all people who fall in with these cults to believe that this is the actual origins of mankind, which, again, my research would indicate that this Adam would be created somewhere in this 5,000 to, let's say, 4,400 BC framework. And
I mean, that current model.
Yes.
This current model, yes.
Yeah. So he would flow forward from that as what his descendants, who would be Canaanites, Hittites, would be included in that. And a plan for world conquest was begun once the Sumerians had taken over Giza and corrupted the mystery school. So if you like, I'll just transition into the origins of the world's major religions from that point, if that's okay.
Just I got a question. So the character that you said Edgar Casey talked about was called Balalai. What's it called again?
Belial, Belial.
Belial. Does that have any connection to Baal or Baal?
Certainly, phonetically, they sound identical. But the term Baal, Baal, is a generic term for Lord.
Lord.
So
yes.
So many people hold that title.
My question is that it looks as if Marduk, who was the chief god in Babylon, he took the title Baal or Baal or Bel. And in the Jewish scripture, he's called Bel Marduk, right? Mm-hmm. Lord Marduk. Also, I equate him to what with the character in the Book of Enoch as Azazel, because Azazel is the one that was told attribute all sin to Azazel. So he was the scapegoat referred to in the Bible. So I just wanted to understand if maybe the Belial is the same character Marduk, because he seems to be the absolute worst of the Anuna gods, because his symbol is actually the bull calf, right? Because you have many references to him when Moses supposedly went to Mount Sinai to receive the tablets from quotation marks God, who I think was Enlil at the time. When he came back down, who were they worshiping? The bull calf, which I attribute to Marduk, because what you're saying seems to align with what I have interpreted, that they try to infiltrate each other's factions, each other's cults. And, this blood sacrifice was always one of the sort of like rituals, rite of passages, or to show your commitment to that particular god. So I just wanted to understand if maybe Bel or Baal or Marduk would be like the same type of character that you were talking about, that is the one that is really pushing the major conquest.
Okay, so here we see a few challenges in trying to dissect all of this. So what I try to do is break it down as best I'm able. And let me just stress this too. I know I sound a little confident when I'm talking. I don't know for 100% sure that I'm like completely right on every single conclusion I've come to. I just look at the evidence and I'm presenting you the case that makes the most sense to me based on what I've researched. And we'll see where all of that leads. But my understanding would be as follows. The reptilians were extremely hierarchical. They were very concerned with who was on top and chain of command. So at the very top of the structure would be the Siakar. These are the reptilians who could fly, the ones who had wings, who had white skin, the shining ones. They were the Elohim who were up in the spaceship. And note too, grammatically, Elohim has always been acknowledged by all ancient scholars as a plural term. It's not singular. The Bible keeps stressing that it's monotheistic, but Elohim is gods, plural. You can see this in the story of the Tower of Babel. Let us go down. It doesn't say let me go down and confound their language. So that's the top of the chain of command, the full-blood reptilians that are on a spaceship who don't get their hands dirty. Then there are underlings beneath them who go by the name of watchers. They also go by the name of seraphim, which translates to fiery serpents. So these are the ground force reptilians who are beneath the Elohim, who are in charge of the operations on the ground to take over the planet. And then you have the Anunnaki, which are a completely different hybrid group who are most comfortable with walking around on the surface of the earth and breathing the earth's air. So Marduk and the rest of the Anunnaki are part of this repulsive hybrid abomination group. Azazel, and another figure who I would actually focus a little bit more on as like the core of evil. He goes by several names too. Many of these characters do. But his name is Semyaza. And for me, he's like the most Luciferian of all the group. So I think it's also very important to understand a dynamic here, because if you don't understand this dynamic, the story gets way more confusing. So let me explain this dynamic. We were mentioning the book of Enoch there. So one of the chapters in the book of Enoch talks about the idea of piety. Okay, so this is an easy word to get tripped on. If you don't know language that well and you hear the word being pious, you might think to yourself, oh, that means being religious. That means being really holy, right? No, it actually doesn't. You have to look up that word and see its precise definition. Piety refers to obedience, compliance, in line. So that is what was going on. The Elohim had a program, and it sounds as if their plan for world conquest was along these lines. We want to use full-blood reptilian forces or pure reptilian hybrids and execute the conquest through those pawns. And if you're going to use locally adapted hybrids, we don't want them to be able to reproduce on their own, because then they might challenge us at some point, no matter how much mind control or threats that we offer them. So don't let them reproduce on their own. This leads to some factions. It sounds as if the Seraphim, once they realize that the Nephilim can be produced as their hybrids, start thinking, hey, we can create our own force, and maybe we can challenge some of the authorities. Maybe we can challenge some of the Elohim. And of course, there's another rivalry that's taking place that everyone knows about, which is between Enlil and Enki, who don't always get along. Marduk is a little bit more on one side of the group, and Enki with him, and then Enlil and his forces are on the other. And there's like massive amounts of Anunnaki that are split into camps. And part of the war for taking over Giza, the Reptile Cyanian War, is not just the Sumerians fighting against the people who are administrating Giza. It actually seems that if you look at the story carefully, like, for example, in the Mahabharata, there's family clans that are fighting. These are called the Pandavas and the Kauravas. But if you break that down, it actually sounds like the Pandavas and the Kauravas correspond to the Enki faction and the Enlil faction. So I think they were actually trying to encode that into the myth to let you know these people were not getting along. And it looks like in the aftermath of the war, when Giza was taken over, that they were still in a rivalry. I mean, because that story actually tracks through ancient history. I get into a lot of that there. So yes, there were definitely a lot of factions. They were arguing with each other and fighting each other. I mean, that's pretty much the nature of the reptilian side. No one's ever safe. No one's on top. And it happens all the way up to the present day. People will be like, oh, join the dark side. You'll be safe. And then you watch what's happening in the present day. These people get thrown in the trash and slain, whenever they're no longer of use. It's really stupid to join the dark side, in my view. But in any case, that's pretty much what happened in ancient times, leading us into the origins of the major religions. Are we ready to go there now?
I got not quite yet. I got something that I wanted to understand. So, how does what are spirit mirrors? Because we didn't really mention them before. So, how are ancient people using them to communicate with other realms? Because you made claim to that. So, what are spirit mirrors? And how do you believe that they were able to communicate with other realms?
Okay, so I started to dig into this topic because it just kept popping up and I wanted to understand it. And the cross-cultural ties are a little bit on the disturbing side as well. So you can create a typical mirror, which most people are familiar with, but in ancient mystical writings, you come repeatedly across something called a black mirror. And you can do internet searches for black mirrors and you can see a lot of imagery, and you can see it looks very much on the dark side, very satanic, very demonic. And you might say, okay, so they maybe just talked about them, but there were no actual black mirrors, were there? Yes, there were. And these were uncovered in ancient archaeological digs all over Egypt, Bushby sites, the finding of a black mirror along with other what appear to be satanic ritual accoutrements that go along with their dark side rituals. There's these snake-like rods that were held in the hands. You can see depictions of that all over the ancient world for people who were on the dark side. But one of the key components of the dark side rituals were literally black mirrors, so that you would stare at them and you would see something that is reflective, but it's pure black. Now, these were apparently used to commune with demons, and from some of the research into the paranormal that I've done, if a normal person stands in front of a black mirror, the only thing you're going to see is your reflection. So how did the dark side do that? Well, I mean, your aura, much as we were talking before about tuning the aura to make certain forms of technology work, you have got to kill all kinds of animals and human beings and just be really committed to the dark side. So when your aura is that far gone, you can apparently stare into these mirrors and you can actually see, because now you've tuned your aura's frequency to demons. So they can start talking to you now, and they can actually manifest in such a way that you can see them. And when I was tracking this particular concept of mirrors, it led me to China, because I actually have a source that tells you that the ancient Chinese, now of course, dragon imagery is all over ancient China. I mean, they constantly make references to dragons. They talk about their dragon forebears. May your child become a dragon. All these references to reptilians because they were deeply involved in their history. I uncovered a Chinese scholar, and of course I didn't leave it in Chinese, which I can't even speak, but it was translated into English, and it shows you an ancient formula for exactly how they were creating these black mirrors. So this is not a realm of myth. This is something that was actually done. Mercury was involved with it. Forms of copper were involved with it. Mercury, by the way, is one of the most potent neurotoxins known. You can do a lot of fancy physics things with it, but it's extremely toxic to the human mind. So it makes me wonder if people were tuned to the dark side even more just by being around so much mercury. Or maybe the Cyanians, who used a lot of mercury, maybe it wasn't toxic to them and it's just toxic to human beings. But definitely there were talks of black mirrors that were used to commune with the dark side, so that many of the people on the dark side, you can look at the reptilian hierarchy, you can look at the seraphim, you can look at the Elohim. But if you start asking questions like, was there anyone really above them? Yeah, Satan, demons, the dark side. But it does seem in the ancient world, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is an example, that when you see some of these clashes and you see what some people would interpret as the wrath of God, or God being upset that people are going too far to the dark side, I do think you have to kind of dissect that a little bit, because in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, it appears as if one of the later variants of reptilian hybrids that are known as the Rephaim were in Sodom and Gomorrah at about the time that was destroyed. And what you see in that time is dissolution, that tons of people were getting drunk. They were cannibals. They were not focused on the plan for world conquest at all. They were just pretty much eating people around them, partying like crazy, getting drunk, committing sins against animals that are described in the book of Enoch and other old books. Basically, they were not focused on the plan to take over the world. So what I'm implying here is that when God blasts them, it's not because so much necessarily because they were so evil, although they were definitely evil, but it's mainly you're not staying focused on the plan for world conquest. The goal here is to take over the planet, and you guys are not delivering, so they get blasted. And then they switch from the Rephaim group to the Horite group, because I show that through Abraham. Because if you go through Sumerian Kings list and you start looking at some of these individuals starting from Adam and you start working your way down, eventually you get to the point where Abraham enters the picture. And Abraham is especially interesting because he is the first person. He's in my writing, I show in H3 that Abraham is not only a descendant of Nimrod, who was actually Sargon, but he was the first person in the world conquest planned not to be full-blood Rephaim or Nephilim. He is part Horite. In other words, he's part of that hybrid line that was started with Horus in Egypt. So now I guess I should segue quickly into the origins of religions, because it really does tie into Horus. Horus was the first of the sun god cult scams, as I would say. So what are the sun god cult scams? One of the things that's most in common with the sun god cult scams is you're a savior. You died and you were resurrected on the third day. And there was a bright star in the heavens commemorating your birth, and you died for the sins of mankind. This starts with Horus. He's the first one, and it carries through a multitude of other characters through space and time, and feeds directly into the origins of major religions. So a part of the story which I do have to introduce because it's relevant is, otherwise the story just gets really confusing, is while many of the Atlantean legacy colonies went into the Mediterranean basin and had an influence on the ancient past, there's a significant infusion of Atlanteans into the story that's special. This is the group that goes to what is called Hyperborea. This is an island that used to exist in the North Sea. It's one of the most prominent of Atlantean legacy colonies. It was settled by Posidonian Atlanteans, not Aryan Atlanteans. In other words, Atlanteans from the western side of Atlantis, not the eastern side. They formed an advanced group which became known as the Sea Peoples and went on a conquering spree further south, all the way as far as Egypt, where some of them were defeated and some of them were also defeated in Greece. But they led to the formation of the Rephaim hybrid group at around the 2000 BC ballpark. And they had an influence on mystery school religions. But after some of these Atlanteans tried to take over Egypt, this is a long story that gets into the shepherd kings who took over Egypt at a certain point in ancient history. They were expelled, and then the new kingdom begins with this despicable figure we know as Akhenaten, one of the Horites for sure, with an elongated head and male and female characteristics. And during the new kingdom, this is really when everything in the world really goes dark and the major religions go into high gear. So Akhenaten, who in my view clearly worshipped Satan, we see that he is partly the figure who was composited with Ezra, who lived 1,000 years later, into the Bible figure known as Moses. So much of Moses derives from Akhenaten. He was basically teaching kind of devil worship type concepts in Egypt. He was expelled from Egypt. Very close to his new city that he created called Amarna was a village called Mal Levi. That's the origin of the tribe of the Levites who were involved in the creation of the Bible. He went with the Levites out of Egypt and eventually moved into the area around Jerusalem. But the other thing that's of tremendous significance to understanding the origins of world religions is who he associated with. So one of the tribes he associated with is called the Mitanni, Mitanni. The Mitanni are of extreme significance to our story because these Mitanni ended up in India, and they were involved with the creation of the Sanskrit language. A number of traditions around the world began with oral traditions before they became written traditions. Sanskrit didn't always exist. It became a written language, coincidentally, right around the time that the Mitanni showed up in India, and the Mitanni all associated with Akhenaten. So this tells you how the stories were taken out of Egypt, transmogrified into the Mahabharata, recorded in Sanskrit, and sort of became public around 800 BC so that they could take liberties with the ancient past, events that happened 400 years earlier. Most people wouldn't know that the history was being doctored in the Mahabharata and stuff like that. But the Hindu religion clearly has its origins from Akhenaten's influence. So we see the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which are collectively part of what's called the Itihasa, forming the basis of the Hindu religion from the warped mystery school that Akhenaten was a part of. According to Tony Bushby, every single pharaoh in Egypt, all through the dynastic period, was initiated in the mystery school in Giza. The very first Roman emperor initiated in the mystery school in Giza. Plato initiated in the mystery school in Giza. They're all getting their information from the same source. So now we see Hinduism launched as a consequence of Akhenaten and the Egyptian mystery school, as I partly described before. I think Buddhism ties into that as well. There are historical ties showing that the area where the Buddha began to offer his teachings are related to a group of people, a tribe of people called the Sakyas. And there's also research indicating that the first people reigning in that territory were Hittites who migrated from Asia. So this is all tied once again to the Sumerians. I'm going to tie this together with some other things here shortly. And then we have Judaism itself. Now, Judaism is largely constructed due to the work of Ezra carrying on the legacy of Akhenaten about 400 years later. And we know this because it is largely Ezra and his writing team as described by Tony Bushby. He has in addition to Secret in the Bible, he also has a follow-up book called Crucifixion of Truth, where he gets into a lot of the history of Ezra. But basically Ezra, Akhenaten as well as Ezra, both went atop Mount Sinai. It's also known as Mount Horeb, by the way. In Lawrence Gardner's work, they found an alchemical workshop that supposedly countless Egyptian pharaoh kings went up to and communed with the reptiles. The reptiles had four major mountain bases that were in Asia. These are well known in history. One is Mount Hermon, Hermon. Another is Mount Horeb / Sinai, where a workshop was shown to exist, where all the kings visited, obviously communing with higher powers when they were up there. The other is the Triple Mount, known as Mount Zion. There's argument about where the fourth mountain was. I happen to believe it's Mount Malaya in Sri Lanka, because there's a lot of evidence to support it, also known as Adam's Peak. You can do investigations into that to see those correlations. But in any event, what Bushby describes is Ezra going up there, getting these instructions from a higher, darker power, and then formulating the Bible. There were actually, believe it or not, as described by Bushby, 94 books that were written at that time. 24 of them were eventually to go into forming the Old Testament. The other 70 were not supposed to be available to the public. As my research and as Bushby's research shows, what happened to those lost books of the Bible? They largely went into forming what in Judaism is called the Kabbalah. So there were Kabbalists who were practicing the darkest secrets of magic that were not to be shown to the general public. So that was how Judaism got its start, once again with Sumerian ties. And of course, Christianity is the next major religion, which we can understand by looking once again back to the Druids that were mentioned before. So I mentioned before about how the Druids had formed the expeditionary force of Chaldeans. Later in the story, we find that Abraham, in this plan of world conquest, was from where? Ur of the Chaldees. So he was associating with Chaldeans. We know this from ancient historical records. We also know that Abraham and his work around that time was associated with advanced forms of technology, believe it or not. So how do we know this? This is kind of funny. I came across this in R.A. Boulet's Flying Serpents and Dragons. And when he first said it, I was like, wow, I never heard that before. And then I was doing casual research later, and then I saw, oh, isn't this interesting? Wikipedia has all this information on this ancient technology, just no one's ever calling any attention to it. So what I'm referring to here are what are called the teraphim, Teraphim. So you can look up articles on them. Now, initially, they're described as idols. So these are like small idol figurine type things. But what were they actually? Field radio sets. And they were installed with crystals, just like a simple crystal radio sets. And these were used in the ancient world to help coordinate the plan for world conquest. And when Akhenaten was not able to use Giza as his base for world conquest and was expelled, Jerusalem was chosen as the next site. So Akhenaten led his forces into the area that is Jerusalem. They won the battle there. They expelled the Rephaim in a war that I describe in H3 called the Rephaim-Horite War. The Rephaim were exterminated. The Horites took over. And Ezra leads the writing team forming the Bible. And it's funny, too, in relation to Ezra, because most of the time, Ezra, again, who's partly the composite of the character of Moses, talks about the laws of God and how you're supposed to follow the laws of God. What did Bushby show? That if you look carefully, look at the wording in all these laws of God, they have a very suspicious correlation to the laws of Hammurabi that come out of Babylon.
I was just going to ask you that. It's like 205 laws, right?
Yep.
In Hammurabi? Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he was basically swiping stuff from Babylon and the Sumerian traditions and saying, yep, this is what God says you need to do from now on. But what happened in relation to Jesus, again, this story is covered extensively by Tony Bushby, primarily in his first book called The Bible Fraud. But the Essene sect, of which Jesus was a part of, I have to break Jesus down a little bit. Jesus is another composite character. He is not one historical figure. Countless figures were amalgamated into the character that is Jesus in the Bible. The primary historical figure is Yeshua. He had a twin brother by the name of Judas Thomas or Judas Crestus. The first time Bushby said that, I was like, I've never heard this before. Where does this Crestus name come from? But if you look into Roman records, you will actually see references to a Crestus with an E, not Christus. Crestus with an E. And this person is associated with the crucifixion. But again, this was Jesus' twin brother. And there's another figure that's amalgamated into Jesus, another primary one. This is Apollonius of Tyana. You can do very deep digging on this website. Two websites I strongly recommend. One is Nazareans.com, Nazoreans.com, and another is Mythicism at WordPress. And this has a lot of this information that I'm uncovering here. But this is basically what was going on with the Essenes and Jesus and the Druids. The Essenes and the Druids, as Bushby shows, had very strong connections. So basically, my understanding is the Druids were still interested in a plan for world conquest that they might be in charge of. So they were keeping tabs via the Essenes on what was going on in Giza and the Sumerians and all their operatives that were continuing the plan after Sumer collapsed. It became Akkad and Babylon, and then went through the Canaanites until Ezra was in charge of this group. But the secrets of Giza were the most important secrets that existed on the planet. Everyone wanted to know as much as they could about what was going on. So what Jesus did because of his father. Okay, now again, I realize this is highly controversial to say this, but I'm just telling you what Bushby found and what I found confirmed myself. The true father of Jesus was actually not God. It was the second emperor of ancient Rome, Tiberius. So Tiberius actually has ties to Phoenicia. So that means that there's a possibility that while Yeshua himself could reasonably be considered of Jewish descent via the bloodlines that Bushby documents, mainly that Yeshua was of the Herodian line of King Herod and the Idumean line, which traces back to the Edomites. So you can make a very legitimate case that Yeshua had Jewish blood. He also had apparently Atlantean blood, and he was close friends with Joseph. Joseph in the Bible is actually Joseph of Arimathea, who was seen at the crucifixion story. Now, there was an ancient tin trade route that went all the way up into England where the Druids were. So the easy way for the Druids to keep tabs on what was going on was via this tin trade route, which Joseph of Arimathea was running. He would trade the tin, he would work his way all the way up to England, give them reports about what was going on. So Yeshua falls in with Joseph of Arimathea. He becomes involved with the Druids. And now there's this plan for the Druids thinking, okay, this is going to be our chance. We're going to start stealing these secrets out of Egypt, and we're going to be in charge of them and get rid of these, reptile groups who are trying to take everything over. So Bushby goes into great detail about this. He talks about how Yeshua, stole the Torah scroll to take the hidden characters that the Bible was written in. This is a very elaborate story. I mentioned before that there's a pyramidion capstone atop the Great Pyramid in Egypt. That capstone is of extreme importance. I mentioned before it was a resonant capstone. Tesla used mass to communicate via copper spheres, but it appears that the Atlanteans used energy because there's a special waveform that's created in a pyramidion capstone. Now, this serpent-like waveform, if you view it from different angles, you get the characters that are in ancient Hebrew. So they created the actual letters of their alphabet as different perspectives of this energy waveform. And Yeshua and Apollonius of Tyana were apparently involved in this mission of stealing secrets out of Giza, taking them to the Druids so that they could be in charge of as much secret knowledge as possible to challenge the Sumer group. So that's really where Christianity has its roots, once again tying itself to Egypt. And as Bushby shows in his book, I think it's Crucifixion of Truth, in which we get this story, the founder of Islam, Muhammad, was actually a cardinal in the Christian traditions, and he was trying to become pope, but they were not going to let him become pope, and he got extremely angry and said that he would have his vengeance. And then he has a strange mystical experience in a cave, and next thing you know, this strange individual whose original name was apparently Lothar Schmalfuss changes his name, and he becomes the figure known in history as Muhammad, and he founds Islam. So once again, we are tied to the mystery schools and ancient Egypt. So to recap, we have the Hindu religion, the Buddhist religion, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all tied to mystery schools or cults. And if you wanted to, you could easily tie in Gnosticism, Hermeticism, even Pythagoreanism into this mix as all cults that influenced the human mind. And one of the most important 3-step themes that I will mention in relation to this, theme number 1, submission. The word Islam itself translates as I submit. So the first theme of all these religions, submission. You submit to authority. Second theme, enjoy agony. In each religion, there is suffering that you're supposed to embrace. In Buddhism, there's asceticism. Don't like the material world. Don't be worried about being well fed. Don't be worried about being fully hydrated. Live like a wandering ascetic. All these religions embrace that you suffer now, and then theme number 3, in the end, you'll get to paradise. Okay, that's a little curious. Okay, so you're going to get to paradise, but you're not supposed to strive for any kind of paradise now. You're supposed to suffer like crazy for now, but then you can get to paradise later. And unfortunately, if you look spiritually at what is most likely to happen to you if you go through a life of suffering and torment, the only paradise that you would really end up in would be a paradise where people are suffering, which would probably be hell. So basically, all of this is the dark side that the religions seem to be tuning you to. And I can gladly turn to the Atlantean original 7-step path to enlightenment, that was turned away. But if you have any other questions before, I will pause.
Yes, tell us that, and then we can wrap it up, because I want to end on a bit of a positive note, because I try to, when I unpack very deep, dark, dense information like this, to give people a bit of hope. And, I want to cover that in the end so that people can get their minds blown and then say, okay, I see there's a way out. They can, and they're not think that they don't become nihilistic, right? Because it's easy to absorb this information and think, oh my goodness, my life is over. There's no choice. I'm being controlled. I can't do anything. But you clearly have other information that helps stuff. So talk about the 7 plan, the enlightenment, and then we wrap it up and stuff like that.
Okay, so after I finished writing H3, the thing that stood out to me the most was the corruption of the original 7-step plan to enlightenment. So I thought, is there any way I could resurrect it using what I knew? And yes, I think there was. So I took my best shot at it, and I turned that into a fictional novel called The Math Wizard. So what is the vision for positivity that the Pleiadians were originally trying to share with us? I believe it was as follows. Step 1, math and materials. Step 2 remains the same, geometry and architecture. Step 3 becomes logic and flows. Step 4, vibration and chemistry. Step 5, spectroscopy and astronomy. Step 6, music and being. This was completely removed from the gutted down version. And step 7 was final revelation. So I know we're running short on time, so I will just say in relation to final revelation, in both the dark side and the positive side, final revelation was fairly similar. We know that there were ancient psychotropic drugs that were used in the mystery schools in Egypt. Among them were the Amanita muscaria mushroom, blue lotus flower, and extracts from pine cones. What would happen in initiation at the very end is that after you had proven your knowledge, you would have an out-of-body experience induced. Your soul would leave your body. It would then experience what's called theophany, or the revelation of the gods. You would see that there are beings on other frequencies, that their soul is real, that there is life after death. Every single person who went through the mystery schools and graduated, got to the very end, had this out-of-body experience. They knew the soul was real, even if you didn't. They knew there was life after death. They knew that there was possibilities for life on other frequencies. So I believe the Atlantean path was designed to guide you both physically and spiritually. So if you go through math and materials, you're going to learn how to build a house, and you're going to build a house efficiently. You'll be free for the rest of your life. Geometry and architecture will make sure that that house stands. Logic and flows is going to guide things into your home, like water and electricity and ether. You make these things flow with grace and elegance in that third step. Vibration and chemistry starts teaching you about the musical relations of the different elements that are in the periodic table. For example, oxygen, sulfur, and copper are all octaves of each other. Look up their numbers on the periodic table to see what I mean. There's a book called Biological Transmutations by Louis Kervon, and he talks about the possibilities of bacteria transmuting elements at room temperature. These are some of the things that would have been learned in that next phase. Spectroscopy and astronomy, that every body gives off a spectrum of light, including human beings. The path to enlightenment involves balancing the colors that are coming off your aura and intensifying all of them until they're balanced. You'll be balancing all 7 chakras to fully energize your soul. And then once you've done that, you hit final revelation, which in the positive version, you will see that there is life on positive frequencies beyond you. And that's waiting for you as long as you turn away from the dark side. Don't try to conquer nature. Exist in harmony with nature. And that is the best path to the positivity and the light.
Okay, so let us shift gears to talk about healing, self-empowerment, and civilization rebuild. So in natural healing, self-empowerment, what's the number one healing truth that could disrupt the medical industry?
That the essence of health should be defined positively, and the way to define health positively instead of negatively. In other words, if you ask most people what does it mean to be healthy, they'll say it means not being sick. But that is a negative definition. It's not a positive definition. What does it actually mean to be healthy? It means flow. In the body, there are these 7 pathways that I make reference to. The first is ki, or chi, or life force that goes through the human body. Electricity, magnetism, water, lymph, blood, and oxygen. If you can make all of those flow through your body without obstruction, you will be healthy. So this is the key. And you do this by harmony with nature. You eat natural foods like fruits and vegetables with enzymes contained in them so that you create no blockages inside your body to have optimum health. And health is ultimately musical. Think of taking foods in as frequencies. You take in those frequencies until you become music, until all the colors in your aura are balanced, all the sounds that are literally the notes that are coming out of your voice show a full octave strength in notes all across the octave. So if you do that, you start by balancing your pH. So if you can attain and maintain a waking salivary pH of 7.4 and make all of your internal organs, especially the paths of detox, these include the intestines, the liver, the kidney, the lungs, and the lymphatic system and the skin, make all of them flow perfectly, you will be healthy.
Okay. And why is self-efficiency so vital in today's world? And what's your vision for the independent homestead of the future?
Okay, so in the United States, we've had what we call our founding fathers who gave us this vision of freedom that is supposed to be the United States. But one of the more neglected of the founding fathers is a man by the name of Dickinson. He stated the following: we cannot be happy if we are not free. We cannot be free if we are not secure in our property. We cannot be secure in our property if others, without our consent, may take it away. So the true essence of freedom is not freedom of speech or freedom of press or freedom of religion. Do you have the ability to have your own property so that no one can take it away? Because if you have that, then you can produce your own water on your own property. You can grow your own food on your own property. You can do whatever you love to do because you have the means to survive on your own property. And you can do that for all your days until you become the best you that you can possibly be. And I have guidance for my vision of how to do that in the technology section of my website.
You know, that's very interesting because what you said is true. Today, we are focused on freedom of speech. But in reality, if you don't own your property, because, I mean, United States is a bit mad in the sense of like, if you have a well on your property, you can't even pump your own water. You can't do certain things on your own property. And I'm like, does the property actually belong to you? So what you're saying actually makes a lot of sense because having your own property should give you the absolute autonomy to do whatever you want in your own land, as long as you're not harming, I guess, other human beings or harming anything. You know?
Exactly.
So that makes total sense because it's almost like if we've been, because like, okay, I lived in the UK for many, many years, and this is a concept that a lot of people don't really know. But in England, you don't really actually own the land that your house is on, you know. That's owned by the crown. So it is owned by His Majesty. Before it was Her Majesty when it was Queen Elizabeth. So you don't actually own, you own the building, but not the actual land on the building. So your house can be taken away from you by force at the behest of His or Her Majesty. So it is, I guess, while it is blatant there in the United Kingdom in terms of like that, I guess it's through the back door that people don't own their own land because you if you were to find oil on your land, you couldn't drill your own oil. You couldn't pump your own water. You couldn't do all kinds of stuff, you know?
Freedom is an illusion in that sense.
Absolutely. So it's almost like if we've been hoodwinked that we actually have freedom, but what was the name of that founding father again?
John Dickinson.
Was his name? John Dickinson. Yeah, John Dickinson. So it appears that he like pretty much saw what real freedom is, and we've been sort of hoodwinked to think what freedom is. So what does an optimal civilization actually look like, and what's the first thing we must do to build it?
Okay, so as we go through history, we see what the dark side was trying to condition us to understand as optimal civilization. They had three different visions: governmental, religious, and financial. Plato's Republic is an example. If you have the optimal government, then supposedly you have a paradise civilization. Religious fanatics. Utopia will be the first example. Sir Thomas More, people can argue whether or not he was facetious when he wrote it, but some people believe, oh yes, if you only have the right religious government, you're going to be fine. Other people will say financial. Communism is an example. If the workers overthrow the people who own the means of production, then you'll have paradise. All of these visions come from the dark side. None of them are what I would propose as optimal. So what is optimal civilization? Harmony with nature. To understand harmony with nature, you have to master the 10 basics of civilization. There's no way around it. So what are the 10 basics of civilization? They are in order: water, sanitation, food, shelter, power, heating, cooling, lighting, telecommunication, and transportation. The Atlantean way was to show us how to do all 10 of those in perfect harmony with nature with extreme efficiency. If you do that way, you're going to be incredibly healthy. You're going to probably be physically fit if you exercise the right way. And your mind will have the knowledge it needs to totally enjoy your entire life. And you will have an incredibly long lifespan. I'm in the ballpark right now of human regeneration simply through nutrition alone. The ancient Atlanteans had a way of doing it through a powdered gold drink, but your lifespan should be at least 120 to 150 years. In Natural Healing Self-Empowerment, I do cite the instance of a farmer who existed in the 1400s who lived to 150 years old. So this is a real human being. He didn't even have any advanced tech. But if we master the 10 basics of civilization in harmony with nature, which I map out in my website how to do that, that is optimal civilization. You start from everyone having their own independent homestead, their kings and queens of their own few acres. And then if they want to associate together in positive ways and have cities where you have cultural manifestations, art, music, engineering, where you're showcasing that you're improving the quality of life. How do you show that you're improving the quality of life? Through the simplest of standards. You look primarily at infant mortality, morbidity, which is the incidence of disease, and lifespan. You know you're on track with the 10 basics of civilization if all indicators of life are positive.
You literally just confirmed a term that I coined, which is the 3 main religions that rule the planet, which are the religion of money, the religion of government, and organized religion. And I've been saying that for the last 3 years, and I have coined that term because there's no one else that I've ever heard actually say that these are the 3 main religions. And you literally inadvertently confirmed that when you're talking about these are the structures that the dark forces use. So thank you very much for that, because, a lot of people I find that the same mindset exists between status, religious people, and people that are just into consumerism and whether they worship money or not. And the same sort of mindset where when you try to explain things to them, they vehemently push back and they're basically like zealots because they're religious, that's their religion. So if someone listening wants to take back control of their health, mind, and future, what's the most important first step they should take today?
Understand that working with nature is the best way to go. So there's a documentary that's linked in Natural Healing Self-Empowerment. You can go see that documentary right now. It's called The Gerson Miracle. This was an individual who was curing cancer through nutrition. So it's a great orientation for people who are new to natural nutrition. He just used fruits and vegetables. He testified before Congress that he had cured cancer more than 50 times through his nutrition. And unfortunately, the dark side did kill him at the end. As the documentary concludes, just like so many other people I know who did work similar to mine and they also got killed, he was killed by arsenic poisoning. And you will see that in the documentary. But you can at least learn the basics of working with fruits and vegetables in their natural state and growing foods with rock dust. That's another thing I always stress. It's one of the most important ideas in relation to growing food that most people don't know. They'll use industrial fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. You should not be growing food that way. You grind rock to powder or dust. Take granite. Granite is the best one. Cover it with a tarp or a plastic bag. Smash it with a sledgehammer until you get powder if you can't do any other means of creating rock dust, or you can buy it online from different sources. Put that in your soil. The plants will grow in ways that you have never seen before. And those plants will be incredibly healthy. They will need no herbicides, no pesticides. And because they're radiant with life, when you consume them, you become radiant with life. So that would be a great place to get started.
By chance, are you referring to potash?
Okay, so potash is another term for potassium. And the potassium is quite rich in granite rock dust. So yes, plants do need potassium, but the best way to get it is through minerals in rocks, such as granite.
And for those interested, we have a podcast already done with Ronald Cave that you can check out on some of the tips and secrets on how to grow food successfully. And if you wanted to make a business out of it as well, there are lots of tips in there as well. And so what's the most unbelievable truth you've discovered that you now consider undeniable?
Wow, that's a tough one. I would say that maybe off the top of my head, when I myself actually started having out of body experiences, I know that when I was younger, I had a lot of dreams, and it was very strange. I met this girl when I was in college, and she was sharing with me the writings of Richard Bach, and she kept looking at me kind of strangely, and from time to time, and she'd say, "Have you had an out of body experience yet?" And I would laugh about it, and I would say, "No, that's never happened to me. I've had lucid dreams and stuff like that, but I've never had an out of body experience." And she kept asking me about that over and over again, and I kept saying, "No, I still haven't had one." She kept looking at me, and she said, "Someday you will." And then several years later, I actually did start having out of body experiences. So that was very strange. And I remember the very first time that this happened to me was, very, very weird. I mean, my soul literally separated from my body in my apartment, and it floated up in the air. And I actually passed through the door of my apartment because I was living in this building where there were several other people. And the guy across the hall came out of his apartment, and he was looking up, like sort of where I was, as a ghost floating in the air. And he's like kind of looking right at me, and he couldn't see me, and he was puzzled. You could see he was puzzled. He's trying to grapple with something, and he's like, "Huh? What's that?" And it was almost like he could sense that somebody was there, but just couldn't see anybody. And then my soul snapped back to my body, and that was the very first one I had. And then I started having multiple out-of-body experiences where I was going back in time. So when I could do that, I started trying to go back to Atlantis and started trying to go back to ancient Egypt. And I saw some extraordinary things in those travels. I saw some really dark things in some of those travels. But for me, confirming the reality that the soul is real and that you actually can travel out of your body through changing your vibration. There's something I called astrokinetics, which is that when you're falling off to sleep, if you vividly imagine that you're doing jumping jacks and you move your life force like you're doing jumping jacks, but not physically moving your body, you can induce this vibration, which starts above the roof of the mouth and the pineal gland, change your frequency and go out of body. So I think for me, all the experiences I've had in relation to developing skills in that regard, that's probably one of the weirdest things that I was not expecting to ever encounter when I was a kid.
Wow, what a way to end this show. Tim, this has been an awesome conversation. Please tell the lovely folks at the Conscious Man 7 where they can find you, if you have anything you want to promote, how we can support you, and all that kind of good stuff.
Okay, so I did provide you with some links in an earlier email. If there was any way for you to provide those in the description of your podcast, that'd be a great help. Other than that,
absolutely.
If you can go to the Google search engine and type in the name of my company, which is Polytope Press, Polytope, then a space, and then the word press, Press, I should be the first company that comes up. And as mentioned, I offer natural healing self-empowerment, Optiflex for individual fitness without using a gym, the history book, Hidden History of Humanity, which we've discussed extensively here today, The Math Wizard with a 7-step path to enlightenment, as well as a little booklet I put together on the history of free energy and some things that you might be able to explore if you want to take a look at free energy. Tons of fiction. If you want to visit, there are free articles, so you don't have to buy anything. You can maybe just grow by reading about the work I did in creating the three-dimensional periodic table of the elements. That's free. And the article on the new theory of the origins of species, the musical design of species, that's also free, along with other things. And I just like to hear from people who are trying to be positive and make the world a better place. So if you want to just drop me a line and let me know that you're out there and positive, that's good too. But whatever you want to do, I hope you visit.
Yes, folks, go and support Tim. He's doing some awesome work. This was a epic conversation. If you realize I didn't really say much at all because Tim pretty much ran the show. And I really enjoyed it and learned quite a lot as well. So guys, as you know, I'm an online fitness trainer. So we talk about all these kind of stuff with clients that I work with. So I help spiritually incline people burn fat and build muscle. So if you like this kind of information, you want to learn more, you want to improve mentally, spiritually, and also physically, of course, hit me up on my Instagram at Adriano_246 or my name Todd Cave and send me a message. And as you know, folks, I can help you to connect with some magic mushrooms. So if you are currently on a spiritual journey and you would like some help removing some fears and traumas, or you would like to start a spiritual journey, again, hit me on my socials at Adriano_246 or my name Todd Cave. And today I am wearing the Todd and Me shirt. This is the flagship for the Todd and Me store. So if you would like to support this podcast and help us out with things like editing and also, wear a cool shirt, as you can see here, so video viewers can see the shirt. So if you would like to support this podcast, head over to our Amazon store, Todd and Me. Link will be in the description of this podcast. Guys, if this episode cracked open your worldview or gave you chills, do 3 things for us. Subscribe to the Conscious Man 7 podcast, leave a review, and share this episode with one person who's ready to wake up. And if you want to see a part 2 with Tim Kelly, drop a fire emoji in those comments or DM me on Instagram, because there's some things that we didn't even share today. So if you would like to see a part 2, let us know and we organize it with Tim and bring it back on and we can go even deeper. Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. I really enjoyed the conversation. You are a wealth of knowledge, and I certainly learned a few things today, and I will definitely be re-listening to this podcast probably 2 or 3 times, because it was, even for me, a little bit of information overload, but this is why we have technology and we can listen to podcasts more than once. So Tim, thanks again for coming on to the Conscious Man 7. And guys, it was another one. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and to share. And we have some more great, amazing guests like Tim coming. So keep smiling, keep shining, and keep being the change you want to see. Speak to you soon. Cheers and namaste.